All right, welcome everybody. The presentation is going to start in a few minutes, starting at 3 p.m. Right, so in just 4 minutes, we're going to start. Is my microphone okay? Can you guys hear me? Is my audio okay? Okay, make sure I'm on mute. Make sure I'm on focus mode so nobody sends me text messages. Right. 你好, Elizabeth. Right, in 3 minutes. Is my audio okay? Can you hear me? Well, my OBS says my audio is okay. Awesome. Great. Okay. Okay, in just a few minutes. Right, I just want to grab that drink. Okay. Make some tea. Great. Okay, just in 2 more minutes. 你好, 马慧, 热爱, Krashen Kartoffel. Welcome again. Do you guys have any questions before I start? I keep looking this way because your chat is on the separate monitor. All right. I'm getting the pre-presentation jitters. Hopefully I can calm down. Okay, 1 more minute and then we'll start.老师现在在哪儿？现在在温哥华，在加拿大。刚从日本回来。Okay, so it's 3 p.m. and let's start the presentation. So the title of the presentation, again, it's HSK4 to HSK6 in 600 hours, how I did it. And this is the second episode of 7 episodes. And just to recap, in the past few months, I went to Kyoto University. And in the meantime, I spent about 609 hours to pass the hardest Japanese test, the JLPT N1 test. And I got 100 out of 180, which is not a very good score. This is exact the passing grade. So if I got 1 point less, I would have failed. Okay, so I got the exact passing grade. So in this series, I'm going to share what I did to be able to get to this point at such a short time, in just 609 hours. So in the last live stream, in episode 1, I got some comments from you guys. So some of the comments are saying that 3 months is really unrealistic, right? Because I did it in less than 3 months. I kind of regret putting the emphasis on the number of months. I think really what we should focus on is the number of hours, right? So the number of hours is set, but how many months are you going to spread out those number of hours? You have to make your own decision, right? Last time I mentioned that from 0 to HSK6 or C for C1 or JLPT N1, it's going to take, according to the Foreign Services Institute, it's going to take 3,080 hours, right? 3,080 hours. So if you know no Chinese and you want to get to HSK6, you're looking at a total of this number of hours, okay? So really, we should focus on the hours and not on the number of months, because the number of months can vary depending on how many hours you pack per day, right? And if you want to do it really intensely, you can do 6 hours a day, 7 hours a day, 8 hours a day, or even like 11 hours a day, right? If you neglect food and rest, you can actually achieve a very high intensity. But the number of hours is pretty much this much. Okay, so we should focus on the hours and not the months. And according to the Foreign Services Institute, if you look at their papers, it looks like every week they're going to spend 4 hours per day of class, 3 hours a day of outside studies, times 5 days a week. And then for Chinese or Japanese or Korean, it's going to take 88 weeks, and that computes to 3,080 hours, according to these two reports. So if we assume that each level is going to take twice as much time as the previous level, then we can deduce that from HSK 4 to 6 will take about 2,310 hours. Okay, so out of the 3,080 hours, 4 to 6 will take you 2,310 hours. Okay. But how long did it take me? Well, actually, because kanji sphere learners, that is basically people who use a pair of chopsticks for both breakfast, lunch, and dinner. If you're one of us Asians, it's going to take you significantly less number of hours, right? So it's going to save you with 1,000 hours according to some sources. But for me, because I only aimed for the bare minimum of JLPT N1, right? I only aimed to pass. I didn't aim to get a really high score. I only aimed to pass. And also I did very intensive studies and used some learning strategies. It actually cut my number from 1,310 to 609. Right? So I only logged 609 hours and was able to barely just pass the test, right? So basically, I had a 50% reduction of the typical number of hours, even for Asian learners, right? Because I already know Chinese characters. And given the same advantage, it was expected I would spend at least this number of hours, but I did it in this number of hours just because I had lower expectation, right? I only was aiming to pass. And also JLPT N1 is only testing your reading abilities and listening abilities and not your writing and not your speaking, right? And based on these advantages and also based on strategic language learning with learning strategies, I was able to get this at 50% less the time. So if you were to do the same, let's say you're not a Korean speaker or Japanese speaker or Vietnamese speaker, you'll be looking at a very high number of hours, like 2,310 hours, right? But if you can apply some strategies, and also if you aim at the lower end of the scores, right, you could theoretically, like if you apply the same kind of strategies as I did, you will be looking at this number of hours, right? 1,150 hours. So a more realistic title of the video would be probably like HSK 4 to HSK 6 in 2,310 hours, how I did it, okay, or how you can do it. Right? So even though, theoretically, if you apply all the strategies I'm telling you, and if you only aim for the lowest end of the test scores, you could theoretically pass with this number of hours, but I would recommend just plan for the higher number of hours. Right? Just give yourself enough time, and so that you can pass with a high margin, and then just assume that you're average learner, and then apply the strategies I'm telling you, and then be able to pass the test. Right? So let's just be realistic and be conservative and aim for this FSI hours. Okay, 2,310 hours. So let's change the title of the series to HSK4 to HSK6, not in 3 months, not in 600 hours, but in 2,310 hours. Okay, just so that it's realistic for everybody across the board. Okay. Right. So HSK4 to HSK6, again, the FSI standard says 2,310 hours. And if you really cram, and if you really aim for the lower end of the marks, then you can actually get to that level at 1,155 hours. But if you have L1 advantage, that is, if your first language is one of Korean, Japanese, or Chinese, right, it's gonna give you the L1 advantage. It can really shorten your time to something like 600 hours. But even if you look for the conventional 2,310 hours, even if you aim for just the largest number of hours, and if you only spend 1 hour a day, right, like realistically 1 hour a day, you can still achieve it in 6 years, right? 6 years. If you just keep it up, eventually you'll get there in 6 years, right? So this is 2025. 6 years will be 2031, and 1/3 of the year, so in 4 months, right? So you'll be looking at September 2031. If you be consistent, right? So even with the more pessimistic number of hours, if you're just consistent, you can still get there, right? You can still get there. I mean, if you have started this 6 years ago, you would have achieved a very comfortable HSK6 by now, right? If you just do 1 hour a day consistently for the past 6 years. However, if you can put in 6 hours a day, you can actually just achieve it in just over a year, right? But the key, as we have mentioned last time, is that you need to be consistent, right? You need to have a plan and implement that plan consistently. Let's address some questions. Fabio the Best 89 Lu says, yes, a number of hours could be more realistic. Now the question of all questions would be how to organize the study in those 2310 hours. Yeah, exactly. Thanks for the expected time in years to go from HSK4 to 6 according to the numbers of hours. Yeah, thank you. All right, so I drew 2 big circles. One is life, one is L2 learning, right? So every day you have to spend a lot of time just to organize to just do things in your life. Like you have to work, you have to study, you have your family, you have your marriage, you have your kids, you might have to do other things, right? Play sports, whatever, get healthy. So that's your life. And then you have language learning, right? A lot of times the people think, oh yeah, we have so much things in life, we can't really squeeze that in. What can you do? Well, here's what I think. Sometimes L2 learning and life can overlap, right? For example, if you like watching TV, can you watch TV shows in your second language? Right? Can you, by the way, L2 stands for second language, okay, L2. In this case, for you guys, is Chinese. So can you watch Chinese dramas? And find something that you enjoyable in Chinese and watch it in Chinese. If you like, looking at social media, can you look at like Chinese social media instead, right? Or if you are working, can you do some of your work in Chinese instead, right? Like be realistic, right? If you're able to, for example, if you need to do a lot of reading for your work or reading for your school, can you somehow get ChatGPT to translate that into a simple kind of Mandarin, and then you process the Mandarin? It's gonna take longer, but it's gonna save you time because you're doing life in L2, and this way the two will overlap, and you'll be able to save more time, right? But however the case, as one of you have said, it's really important to plan your hours and be able to stick to a consistent plan. and be able to, like we have mentioned last time in our self-regulation section, we mentioned goal setting, we mentioned strategic planning, we mentioned outcome expectations, right? We mentioned self-recording, right? Recording your progress, as well as self-evaluation, keep monitoring your progress, right? So using all these strategies to keep yourself on track. So this way, even if you only put in like 1 hour a day, you will still be able to achieve it eventually in 6 years, right? If you just implement these self-regulation strategies and keep yourself on track, right? So every year, if you just do 1 hour a day, then you probably want to say, okay, I'm gonna pass HSK 5 in 2 years, and then HSK 6 in 4 years, right? And then in total it's 6 years. And then in order to pass HSK 5 in 2 years, I'm going to do tests every month and make sure that every month I can get a higher score or something, like implement some kind of strategy so that you can stay on track, even if you just do 1 hour a day. Okay, but if you can do 6 hours a day, like what I did, then it's even better. Sometimes it's actually easier if you just somehow organize your life in a way that you can just focus on learning a language for like a stretch of a year, which is what FSI does, right? Which is what the Foreign Services Institute does. Right. And then some users also said, also had questions about the target of the Foreign Services Institute, right? According to the Foreign Services Institute, they want to take you from 0 to ILRS3 R3, that is speaking 3, reading 3, in this number of hours. And some users are saying, their target is not really HSK 6. Their target is what, HSK 4, HSK 5, or something simple, right? Paul Walther said, FSI doesn't seek to get people to an advanced level. So here's what their report said. The report said, the goal of language training for FSI students is typically general professional proficiency, that is S3, R3, that is speaking 3, reading 3. And according to their report, according to this table, speaking 3, reading 3 on the ILR scale is general professional proficiency, right? Able to speak accurately and with enough vocabulary to handle social representation and professional discussions within special fields of knowledge, able to read most materials found in daily newspapers. And according to this particular paper, I did not share the screenshot last time, but according to this paper, it's relating CFIR C1, that is HSK 6, JLPT N1, right, that level, CFIR C1, to ILR speaking 3. So FSR is actually aiming for HSK 6 in short, right? So FSR's target is CFIR C1, JLPT N1, HSK 6, etc., right? Without the writing component. FSI is only training diplomats, right? They're only required to speak and read to process information, but they're not required to write, because usually in their foreign posts at their embassies, they usually have other staff to be able to handle writing tasks for them. So they don't have to write material themselves. They only have to be able to speak and read. All right, then the final comment was, even though those are supposed to be peer-reviewed papers, I hate those classifications, so useless, so subjective, not tackling the real problem of language learning, but creating a framework for schools to get money. Actually, let me just clarify. The Foreign Services Institute is not a profit-making institution. Foreign Services Institute is a branch of America's State Department, and their goal is to train their diplomats or their staffs for serving at a foreign post in as short a time as possible, at the lowest cost possible. Right? Here's a quote from the report. It says, language training programs at FSI are accountable for developing prescribed proficiency levels, that is S3, R3, which we spoke about, in students in as short a period of time as possible. The accountability goes far beyond test scores and end-of-training student evaluations. It goes to whether graduates of our programs can use the language to carry out the important and complex work for which they are responsible. Language educators at FSI get direct evaluative feedback from our clients and stakeholders. When a dissatisfied cable comes to us from post, it receives our immediate attention. Okay? So as soon as you send your students to the foreign post, if they cannot function in the foreign post, I'll say, hey, this guy can't speak Mandarin. Like, he can read. If you're an instructor at the FSI, you're going to hear it, and then you're going to be held accountable. Right? So FSI is trying to train the diplomats to the specified proficiency level in as short a time as possible, but they have to make sure they reach this level. And that's why they assign such a long period of time to training Chinese speakers. And here's some more details. It says, our programs are not given a lengthy period in which to prepare learners to do their work. Right? So they're not given all the time in the world. Right? They have a fixed, limited amount of time. For example, students in the Russian program are expected to progress in 10 months of intensive training from no functional ability in the language to ability to read almost any professionally relevant text and discuss in detail with a Russian speaker any and all implications of that text for Russian-American relations, right? Because they have to promote American interests in their post in Russia. Or Belarus, or any of these Russian-speaking countries. I've learned Russian before. It's extremely difficult. The language it's so difficult, and pronunciation and the writing system and also the grammar, especially the grammar, is so difficult. And they only take 10 months. It's incredible. It's a very short time. And it says there is no time to waste with non-productive activities. Okay. So hopefully this answers your question. Like, the FSI is actually trying to, for many decades, they train like hundreds, if not thousands, of diplomats to their posts at the most extremely efficient way possible. And these hours are time-tested numbers. Okay, so I hold them in high regard. Personally, that's just my perspective. Let me check your comments. Rai says, this is exactly what I do. I'm active in Douyin and Weibo a lot, as well as watching Chinese dramas and variety shows. Great. And it really works for improving listening and speaking skills. Someone told me that the language level of native Chinese in daily conversation is actually no. that is a misconception. Like no, HSK 3-4 is not. It's not functional yet, right? You're starting to speak Chinese, but no Chinese speaker will ever speak at the HSK 3-4 level, because it's barely functional, right? Ascension Games Fluent, it's more HSK 5. I'd say HSK. I mean, comparing native speakers and foreign language speakers, it's very difficult, right? I'd say that any speaker in Chinese, in some aspect, is speaking better than HSK 6, because that's their first language, right? Even though they're not tested, maybe even an illiterate Chinese person will be able to speak in some way better than a foreign, a foreign language learner, right? It's not exactly apples with apples comparison. All right, so in this presentation, let's speak about the necessity to read and listen extensively. And again, for this presentation, I'm going to cover SLA research, that is Second Language Acquisition Research, SLA research, as well as my experience and other people's experience, so that you can get a holistic perspective of this strategy, right? So you know that this strategy works for everybody across the board and not just for me. Okay, and you also understand why it works and not just like some anecdotal experience. Okay, so first let's dig in with the SLA research. The reason why we look at these research is so that we have evidence that this strategy works, and we also understand why it works. Okay. The consensus among SLA researchers is that there are two ways to improve your L2 or your second language. One way is that you can read books, you can watch TV, you can listen to podcasts, etc., right? So consume content. And the other way is with textbook studying, memorize vocabulary lists, etc., right? With a teacher, and here you're using your third hand to memorize vocabulary items and use and write it down in a notebook. So there are two major ways to study a language, according to second language acquisition experts. And the common consensus is that the first way will count more towards your improvement. So this is the principal way to learn a language. And why is that? Well, according to Stephen Krashen, he's really famous in the language learning circles. You can check out his 1980s video, Stephen Krashen on second language acquisition, on YouTube. So he's really famous. You probably have heard of him already, right? In his 2004 paper, he put out these reasons. One of them is the complexity argument. What's the complexity argument? Well, it says many scholars have noted that language is simply too complex to be deliberately and consciously learned one rule or item at a time, right? So language, the volume is simply too large to be able to be taught one at a time. For example, he gave this example. Estimates of adult vocabulary size range from about 40,000 to 156,000 words. And it has been claimed that elementary school children acquire from 8 to more than 14 words per day. So a native speaker will acquire vocabulary throughout their life, and eventually in adulthood they'll get to, as in the lower end, 40,000, and in the higher end 156,000, depending on how you count, I guess, right? Because with English, for example, the word run, runs, running, runner, ran in the past tense, are they different words or are they the same word, right? So there are different ways of counting, and also people have different vocabulary levels, right? So even at the lower end, 40,000, let's just say that vocabulary size needs to be at 40,000. Have you guys looked at the HSK6 textbooks? There are 2 volumes, okay? Guess how many words you're going to learn in HSK6? You're going to learn 2,500 words, okay? So in HSK6, in both textbooks, you're going to come across a lot of really difficult texts, and it's full of new words that you don't know, and there are vocabulary lists. And as you go through them, you'll eventually learn 2,500 words across these 2 volumes. So if you were to learn 40,000 words, you're going to need 16 sets of these, okay? So 32 volumes, 16 sets. With 40 lessons each, okay? So if you do a quick calculation, 40 times 16, that gives you 640 lessons, okay? 640 HSK6 lessons. Can you handle those? It's too large, right? The volume is simply too large. You can't learn them one item at a time. Imagine going to school and then just learn all these one at a time. It's gonna take forever, right? You can't. And another argument is, here it says, not only are there many words to acquire, there are also subtle and complex properties of words that competent users have acquired, right? So words, it's not just a Chinese-English pair, right? By now, if you're a Chinese learner for many years, you realize that Chinese words, a lot of times they have nuances, right? There's also grammatical properties. Here it says, also, when we acquire a word, we acquire considerable knowledge about its grammatical properties. For example, take these sentences, right? John told a joke. right? You can say John told a joke, but you cannot say John told. Right? You can say John spoke, but you cannot say John spoke a joke, right? So tell and speak, they're very similar, but they are used differently and with different grammatical properties. And look at these two sentences. John is easy to please versus John is eager to please. Right? If you say John is easy to please, then John is the object of the verb please, right? John is easy to please. It's easy to please John. Whereas if you say John is eager to please, then John is the subject of please, right? Now John is the person doing the pleasing, even though you're just changing a word, but the grammar of the sentence changed. Right? John is easy to please. It's easy to please John. John is eager to please, but you cannot say it's eager to please John, right? It's not the same, right? So words have grammatical properties that's just not, I mean, sure, let's learn all these vocabulary lists, but you're still not gonna be able to understand the usage and the grammatical properties of words, right? Let alone a single word may have many different meanings, right? When I say I see something, right? I see something with my eyes versus you see, it's nice to see you again. For example, when I say you see, that see means to understand, right? So a word can have many different shades of meaning. So all of that cannot be captured with just textbooks. And another argument is competence without instruction. That is, language can be learned without instruction. People can just simply pick language up. For example, in this Smith and Supinich 1984 study, it tested 456 company presidents and reported that they had significantly larger vocabulary scores than a comparison group of adults did. And then they found that only 3% of that vocabulary, only 3% of that group with large vocabulary use vocabulary books, right? So this group of CEOs with large vocabulary, only 3% of them say that they use vocabulary books. So obviously they have picked up the words, they have picked up that large vocabulary throughout their life incidentally, right? Incidentally. And does it work with foreign language learning? Those CEOs have learned these vocabulary items as their first language, right? What about foreign language? In this Lau and Krashen 2000 study, they compared progress in reading over one semester between university level EFL students in Hong Kong who participated in a popular literature class that emphasized reading for content and enjoyment, and students in the traditional academic skills class. Right? So they compared one group, they just told them to read literature, popular literature, and one of the books is self-selected. And the other group, they follow traditional lessons. Right? The popular literature group made far better gains in vocabulary and reading rate. Right? So they were not taught explicitly, yet through reading, they just picked up language and they actually scored better than the other group, which is amazing, right? And finally, large amount of input, that is, in this example, is extensive reading. Reading a lot actually improves production skills, that is speaking and writing. Okay, so when we talk about perception, it's listening and reading, that's perception. When we talk about production, that is speaking and writing, right? So here, this textbook by Hitchcock and Ferris mentions that having argued that ER, that is extensive reading, promotes various types of schematic development, formal, content, and cultural, it seems fair to assume that having such tools at one's disposal through reading is not only helpful to L2 production, but also indispensable to it. So reading a lot, listening a lot is essential for being able to speak well. Have you seen any person who can speak well, but who does not read a lot? Right? Or do you know any good writer who don't read? Right? So reading a lot and listening a lot is essential if you want to be able to speak well and write well. Right? although they don't guarantee it. If you read a lot and listen a lot, you're not necessarily a good writer, right? I read a lot. I consider myself reading a lot, but I don't write very well. Just because I haven't written a lot, right? You also need to write a lot to be able to get better. But if I never read, if I'm not a good reader, then there's no hope for me to ever become a good writer, because I will not even know the words, right? How am I supposed to pick up the words? So although successful readers may not necessarily be effective writers, it is virtually impossible to find successful writers who are not good readers. Right? So make sure to do enough reading and do enough listening so you can get enough input. Let me check your comments. Realize says, I see, thanks for answering. Maybe difficult, but also interesting, expanding vocabulary is welcome to me. Right. All right. Now, we talked about why input is so important, but how does this work? Like, what are the underlying mechanisms for input to take place? Now, let's dig deeper and explore some of the concepts when it comes to input. The first is Krashen's theory on acquisition and learning. He termed it the acquisition-learning hypothesis. So basically, he is saying that there are two systems involved with language learning. One is acquisition. Acquisition is a process similar, if not identical, to the way children develop ability in their first language. Language acquisition is a subconscious process. We're generally not consciously aware of rules of the language we have acquired. Instead, we have a feel for correctness. Grammatical sentences sound right or feel right, and errors feel wrong, even if we do not consciously know the rules we violated. The second way to develop competence in a second language is by language learning, right? So he contrasted acquisition and learning, these two processes. And with languages that you have acquired, you may not even know the rules that you have learned, yet you're able to identify, that sentence is right, that sentence sounds off. Right? If I tell you something that's ungrammatical, like if you're a native English speaker, I tell you something that's ungrammatical, like he walked to school. You'd be like, he what? Who walked to school? I said, he walked to school. Oh, okay. You know that the word walk has to take on the third person singular s, right? He walks to school. But if I say he walked to school, that doesn't sound right. Although you might not be able to identify the reason. So that's why Krashen says that some language features are simply acquired, picked up unconsciously. We do that as children. But the second system is learning, right? Language learning is more deliberate, more explicit. The distinction between acquisition and learning, as defined by Krashen, is difficult to maintain in its original form. We're going to talk about that later. Nonetheless, the importance of the distinction lives on in today's emphasis on implicit and explicit learning. So reading, listening to podcasts, taking a lot of input, that acquiring language, right? Language acquisition on the left-hand side, this is implicit learning. And on the right-hand side, learning with vocabulary lists, textbooks, etc., this is known as explicit learning, right? Learning in a declarative way, learning words one by one, right? Learning under a teacher, explicit learning. And finally, Krashen also framed it as the input hypothesis. What's the input hypothesis? Krashen says that L2s, or that is second languages, are acquired by understanding messages or by receiving comprehensible input. That is, things you listen or things you read that you can understand, right? Comprehensible input. Krashen defined comprehensible input in a particular way. Essentially, comprehensible input is that bit of language that is heard or read and that is slightly ahead of a learner's current state of grammatical knowledge. Krashen defined a learner's current state of knowledge as I, and the next stage as I plus 1. So if your current level is something like HSK 4, then that HSK 4 level is your I, and you want to aim for I+1. That is something that's just above your level, right? So according to Krashen's input hypothesis, this kind of input, when you listen to or read text that is slightly above your level, then this is when language acquisition occurs. Theoretically, right? This is a theory. It's not been entirely proven. To recap, so here are the related terms, right? On the left, you have acquisition, and on the right, you have learning. Acquisition is implicit, learning is explicit. Acquisition is procedural. That is, for example, when you play basketball, or when you play tennis, or when you just walk, right, unconsciously, those skills are procedural skills, right? You don't have to think about it. You don't have to think, okay, I have to put my left leg forward, and then my right leg forward, and then my left leg forward, right? You don't have to think about how you walk. You just walk, because this kind of skill is already learned. It's already acquired, and it became procedural knowledge. Whereas with learning, you learn declarative things. That is, for example, you learn 苹果 means apple, or 人 means person, right? These are declarative things. These are explicit knowledge, right? These are not subconscious things. But if you're able to just speak Mandarin very fluently, then you're using procedural skills. Acquisition is incidental, subconscious, whereas learning is deliberate and conscious. Acquisition focuses on comprehensible input, whereas learning focuses on memorization and exercises, etc. Acquisition focuses on meaning, and learning focuses on form, right? So with acquisition, when you're reading something, you just want to understand the meaning. Whereas when you're learning, when you're doing textbook exercises, you're thinking, okay, how does this sentence work? Okay, you have to put the subject here, verb here, and so that's focusing on form. Acquisition is focusing on perception, whereas learning is focusing on production, right? When you're in a language class, often the teacher will say, okay, repeat after me, or okay, make a sentence, or okay, can you correct your own sentence, or can you say it again? Okay, now can you do this mock dialogue on stage, right? So when you're learning in a formal situation, they're gonna make you produce language, right? So acquisition focuses on perception, and learning focuses more on production. Any questions? Okay. Now here's a question. Can learning eventually lead to acquisition? That is, if you learn the words really well, if you practice how to use a word, if you build sentences and talk to people with the words you learn, right? Can this eventually automaticize and become acquired, right? Can this, if you learn really well, become acquired language? That's a question that's in debate, right? So there are three theories. The first is a strong interface that's proposed by De Keyser, 1997. Proponents of strong interface suggest that learned knowledge eventually become automated and become acquired skill. Right? Learned knowledge, when automated, becomes acquired skill. And the second proposal is Krashen and Paradis. They propose that there's no interface between learning and acquisition. So Krashen is basically saying, no matter how much you learn, this learned skills and knowledge is not gonna be is not gonna be combined with the acquired knowledge. Krashen is saying the two are always going to be entirely separate, and they serve two functions. It's almost like two different systems. It's like your visual system and your speaking system. They're entirely separate systems, right? So Krashen is saying there's no interface between the two. And the third proposal, the third theory, is the weak interface theory. This is exemplified by Ellis, and he says, or she says, I'm not too sure about the gender, that learned knowledge can become acquired skill, but the two can still work side by side. That is, if you learn something explicitly, and then you also acquire some knowledge implicitly, subconsciously, the learned knowledge can actually help the acquired knowledge. They give the example of, say, walking, right? If you're walking, you're not really thinking about walking, but then if you stumble, all of a sudden you say, okay, I have to do this, right? I have to land on both feet, or land on both hands, or whatever, to catch a fall. Another example is speaking under duress, right? So if you're if you're speaking and you're looking for words, you're struggling, and this is the time when explicit knowledge can come into use. Okay, 1 second. Sorry, I'm back. All right, sorry for the interruption. All right, so the weak interface is saying that the two learned systems, one is acquired, one is explicitly learned, the two can work side by side. For example, if you're speaking under duress, you're struggling to find the right words, like what's happening to me right now. If you make a grammatical mistake, for example, when you want to fix a mistake, you can invoke on this learned knowledge. Okay, I know that this past tense, I need to add an ed at the end of verbs, right? And then you fix your utterance. So I'm more inclined to accept the weak interface, right? So your learned knowledge can eventually automatize into an acquired language, but the two can also work side by side. Right, finally, some tips and caveats about input. Input is essential, but it's not everything, right? So you need to focus both on reading and listening as well as writing, right? You need to spend a lot of time on input, but you can't just rely on input, because eventually you need to you need to practice how to speak. Otherwise, you're always going to be mute in the language. You also need to make sure to diversify your subjects, right? You can't always be reading the same thing. You need to read a variety of subjects, right? Not just nonfiction, but also fiction, right? You need to read news. You need to listen to some songs. You need to do a variety of things, just so that your vocabulary is not too concentrated on one subject. And you need to make sure to engage in multiple modalities, right? Instead of just reading text, you need to listen, as well as watch videos, right? Watch animations, then engage in a variety of modalities, so that you're able to recognize a word not just as a written word, but also as a spoken word. A lot of times, I remember when I was in Japan, I listened to people speak, and I'm like, oh, what are you talking about? And then once they explain it, they write it down, like, oh yeah, that's what it is. Then I realized that I can recognize some words written down, but not be able to recognize them when it's spoken to me. So it's recognizing words spoken and recognizing words visually are almost entirely two different processes. So make sure that you practice with different modalities. And then finally, make sure that you practice at the right level, which I'll talk in more detail right now. So why do we have to practice reading and listening at the right level? Here is what the Foreign Services Institute said. The importance of promoting automaticity is true for reading as well as speaking. Adults need to read considerable amounts of easy material in order to build up stamina and to automatize processing skills. Without some degree of automatic processing capability, reading becomes a painful decoding process, leaving the reader with little cognitive energy available for understanding and interpretation. Right? This is especially true when you're reading something like Chinese that is not a Roman script, right? If you don't read a lot of easy material, you're constantly looking at hard material, then you're not processing as much text as you could, right? If you're reading a lot of easy stories, easy materials, then you can read these easy things over and over, and eventually you build up automatic processing abilities. Then you're not like looking at Chinese characters and decoding it all the time, but you're just glancing at it and you're able to just read very quickly and smoothly, right? That's why you should start with easy material that's right at your level. Otherwise, you're constantly bombarded with new words, and you're just not able to build up this kind of automaticity, right? So this is what the FSI is suggesting us to do. For example, here is a reading passage. Let's see how good your Chinese reading is. This is annotated with Language Player, the app that I developed. And by the way, with Language Player now, you're able to show pinyin just for the hard words. For example, over here, this is a text that's at HSK 7 to 9, right? This is the highest level of Chinese. And only the text that is really difficult is labeled here according to the level. Right, so let's see. 蛙溪井中，日复一日仰望天穹，所见不过尺幅之蓝。遂妄自尊大，自诩洞察世间万象，对外界之事非但无知，且固执己见，视意见为妄言。Right? How much do you understand? How much do you understand that? It's not easy, right? How about this? So this is a HSK 6 level text. The same thing. I just asked ChatGPT to generate this text at different levels. And now let's see what this sounds like. 井中有蛙. Okay, that's already a little bit easier than 蛙溪井中, right? So you don't have to process this new word. 井中有蛙，终日仰望井口之天，所见者不过方寸之间。蛙自鸣得意，逢人便夸，此处水质清澈，居所安稳，人生如此，夫复何求? Right? So this is already a lot easier than the first. Now let's take a look at the HSK 4 level. This is much simpler. It says 从前有一只青蛙. Okay, now this is much simpler, right? 住在一口深井里，他每天看着井口那一小片天空，觉得世界就是那么大。他对井边经过的鸟儿说：“你看看我这井里的水多清澈，我的生活多舒适，你们在外面一定没有我这么快活。” Now this is way simpler, right? Now this is now you might be able to understand this by now. So again, with the Language Player app, now you can choose your own level in your profile, in your user profile. You can choose your level. In this case, I picked HSK 6. HSK 4 for this particular paragraph. And then the system will only label words that are above HSK 4. So if you pick HSK 4, it's going to ignore all the words, but only label the words above HSK 5. Right? So any words that's at HSK 5 or HSK 6 or higher are going to be labeled. So this way, you can start reading it, and then if you notice a word that's not labeled yet, you don't know, right? If you're, let's say, you're not able to pronounce 舒适 over here, right? If you don't know what this word, then you can tap on it and you can get the definition and make sure to learn it, because this is the word that you require to know for HSK4, right? So that's a new feature in Language Player. Go check it out. So that's HSK4. 从前有一只青蛙住在一口深井里. Now that's way easier to comprehend, right? Finally, this is a HSK2 reading. Now this is really simple. 有一只青蛙，它住在井里。它每天看见一点点天。他说：“天不大，世界很小。”青蛙很高兴，他觉得这里很好。Now, pretty much all of you understand this, right? Maybe 青蛙, you might need help with 青蛙. 青蛙 means frog. 井 means a well, 井里. And that's it. That's all you have to know for this entire paragraph. You only have these two words, right? So this might be the appropriate I+1 for some of you, right? So what is your I+1? Right? What is your level? When I asked ChatGPT to generate this story, it generated this text. And I said, okay, this looks about HSK4. When I plugged this into a language player, it seems like HSK4 will label like this number of words, and it looks like this is a HSK4 level text. Then I asked ChatGPT, okay, generate a HSK6 for me, and it gave me this. And then I said, generate a HSK 7 to 9 for me, and then it gave me this. This sounds very classical now, right? And then I said, okay, give me a HSK2. Now it's like, okay, 有一只青蛙，它住在井里. This is really simple now, right? So with Language Player and ChatGPT and these AI tools with technology, you can, even if you have difficult text, you can still say, okay, lower the level to my level. Okay, I'm HSK4. Can you make it HSK4, please? And then use Language Player to read it, and then you can expand your vocabulary at the right pace. Okay, any questions? Awesome. Now we have finished the SLA research part. Now let's move on to my own experience. For listening, I watched 3 animes, right, in total of about 50 hours or so. And then for reading, because I was taking a Japanese language course, I had a textbook, right, Minna no Nihongo. And at the beginning of the semester, I read all the text in the textbook. I read all the dialogues. I read all the reading passages and everything, right? Because I have to study this anyways. So I thought, okay, I'll just read everything in there. Without doing exercises, I'll just read everything in there. And then I read a novel, Kirawareru Yuki. And then I read Konbini Ningen, right? I read these 3 books for reading. And then for looking up words, I actually use my own language player, and so that it can help me read faster. Right? I use technology to make reading easier. For example, I can just tap on the word, and then I can get a definition of it. I can tap on Let ChatGPT Explain, and then it will give me like a explanation about the word in this context. If I don't understand the sentence, if I understand all the words but not the sentence, I can still ask ChatGPT to explain the sentence to me. And then I can keep track of my vocabulary with Language Player. And now I can actually export this to Enki. Even the video content, the video context of the word can also be exported into Enki. So I can use a spaced repetition system to help me retain the grammar. Retain the vocabulary. More about this later in another live stream. And remember what I said about life and L2 learning overlap. You can have an overlap portion where you have life in L2, right? For example, if you have to study a subject, or if you are reading a news article, can you read it in Chinese? If you like the English content, if you like the English news article better, for example, you can maybe ask ChatGPT to translate it into Chinese and then study it in Chinese, right? So if you have more incidental learning, then you can maximize your learning time. For me, learning Japanese, for example, I set my computer and my phone to Japanese, right? So, for example, this is my Keynote interface. This is where I prepare this presentation, right? So when I work, all my computer interface is in Japanese. And also, when I generated this image with ChatGPT, remember this image with 3 hands? ChatGPT drew 3 hands. When I generated this image, I gave the instruction all in Japanese, right? The more I write, the better my Japanese is going to become, right? So this is how I maximize my incidental learning. Just use everything and just do everything in Japanese. Set the computer and phone to your target language. Use ChatGPT only in the target language. Translate material into the target language for reading, and use the target language for work and school if possible. Okay. Any questions? So that's my experience. And finally, let's look at other people's experience in how they have maximized their input. For example, as we have mentioned last time, this user, Taira no Ronemori, he got 179 points out of 180 points. Right? This is near perfect in just 17 months, which is incredible. Right? From 0 to a near perfect N1 score in just 17 months. And he said he spent about 1,400 hours in his, which I discussed in my previous live stream. And he said, I started to do rewatches of anime I like using Japanese subs. Right? So he watched a lot of anime in Japanese and followed along with Japanese subtitles. And he also read a whole bunch of texts like Ginga Tetsudo no Yuru and Konbini Ningen, which I also read. Right? I also read this one as well. Right? So we share some of our input inventory. And for listening, he said he listened to a lot of podcasts, right? And he made this big infographic about what he did. He watched all these TV shows and anime, most of which I cannot identify. And he read all of these books. I can identify this, Ginga Tetsudo no Yuru, and Konbini Ningen. I read those two. I also read Ningen Shigaku, which is also a classic, right? And I don't recognize anything else, unfortunately. I also listened to the same podcast he listened to, right? Incidentally. Yeah, so as you can see, he did a lot of reading and listening, right? Yeah, quite a lot. So that's what really helped him to get this incredibly high score. Okay, so reading and listening and doing this mass input really helps. And finally, this user named Steve IJ3, sorry, I'm just butchering your name. So he, in his YouTube video recap of his experience, he mentioned that he used the mass immersion approach. And as a result, he got 137 out of 180, right? Not as good as the other guy, but also pretty high, higher than me, right? He's 37% better than me. So, and he's not even Chinese, right? He's not even Asian, right? So he had like theoretically he has to put in almost twice as much effort, but he did it, right? And he did it better than me, and he championed this MIA, mass immersion approach. He said, following Matt's MIA method, or mass immersion approach, he said, it's basically that only a small part of your learning comes from textbooks and grammar at the beginning, while almost all the rest is from reading and watching things you're interested in. Right? So this is a transcript of his YouTube video. I'm just reading it to you. He says, basically, you need to focus on your input rather than grammar and textbooks. And what's the mass immersion approach? Well, it's basically like a input-based learning approach that's championed by this particular YouTube user, Matt versus Japan. He put out a lot of videos championing this input-based approach. And this is not rare. This is extremely common. Many users on YouTube, if you just Google input, language input, comprehensible input, or input-based learning, you find a lot of videos. Like this guy, Chris Lonsdale, and Stephen Krashen, our beloved linguist, and this YouTuber, right? And also this guy, Jeff Brown. They all have like millions of views, which I'm very jealous of. Hopefully one day my speaking skills can improve and my YouTube videos will also get many more views. And then this YouTuber, Lindy Botis, he's also a very famous South African, now living in Singapore, and he's a UI designer. And he also champions this input-based method. Mandarin Blueprint, which is our principal competitor, our arch enemy, they're also championing this this input immersion approach, right? Steve Kaufman, he also lives in Vancouver, incidentally, right? I met him a couple times, but we haven't interacted much beyond that. He has this product named Link, L-I-N-G-Q, Link, L-I-N-G-Q, which is very, very similar to our language player reader, right? Except everything is blue. You should go check it out. So all of these guys, they're just championing the same thing, right? Basically, you're supposed to focus on acquisition and comprehensible input rather than focusing too much on this traditional learning. Right? So all of them are saying the same thing, which is this is nothing new, right? Learning languages requires a lot of reading, a lot of input. It's been time immemorial, I guess, right? People have been learning languages like this throughout history. So this is nothing new. We're just saying that we should definitely put in a lot of time these days reading a lot of interesting material and taking in a lot of input. And this is also more enjoyable, right? If you have to study everything with the textbook, if you have to study those standard HSK textbooks and memorize vocabulary lists, if this is all you do, then it's going to be really tough, right? It's going to be really boring. But if you're just watching Chinese dramas, or if you're just, reading or reading mangas, or reading novels, and reading something that you actually enjoy, then you can learn languages in a lot less tedious way. So in summary, acquisition requires a large quantities of input, right? And input can be enjoyable. It doesn't have to be tedious. You should choose input at your level, and you should pick a diversity of subjects. And also you should engage in a diversity of modalities, right? You should listen as well as read. Any questions about this presentation before we conclude? Right, and also input is essential, but it isn't everything, right? You need to also put in some extra practice with grammar, with speaking, which we'll eventually talk about in our series. And finally, here are some references. And then the next presentation, in this presentation, we talked about read and listen extensively. And next time, we're going to talk about learning just enough grammar at the right time. Okay. All right. Are there any questions about what we've covered today? If not, I will conclude. Okay, this presentation has been long enough. It's been over an hour, and let's conclude. 老师, what's your app again? It's called Language Player. Right here. Here's an URL. Here, languageplayer.io. Language Player. Okay. Any other questions before we conclude? Okay, so if you remember anything, if you want any specific help with anything, please leave a comment below, and I'll answer them in our next live stream. Okay, all right, take care.